Good morning and welcome to the second day of the conference on Johnson's Constitutional Reform Agenda, co-hosted by the Constitution Unit at University College London, the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, and UK in a Changing Europe. Welcome back to those of you who were with us yesterday. The 20 hours since we parted have not been undramatic for politics in the UK. Our next session at 10:30 will be focusing on devolution and the future of the Union, no doubt with an eye to last night's developments in Northern Ireland. The final panel at 12 will look across the balance between Parliament, the Executive and the courts. But in this first session, we're focusing on elections and referendums. I'm Alan Renwick, and I'm your chair for this session. The government has a substantial reform agenda relating to elections. Its planned Electoral Integrity Bill will seek to require voters to show ID at polling stations, introduce tighter controls on voting by post or proxy, ease access to voters with disabilities, and remove the 15-year limit on overseas voting. In one of the less high-profile news stories of the last 20 hours, the government yesterday announced proposals for some additional measures to make the Electoral Commission subject to tighter parliamentary oversight, stop the Electoral Commission from bringing criminal prosecutions, and limit the voting rights of EU citizens arriving in the UK after the 31st of December 2020 to those from countries with reciprocal deals with the UK. And back in March, the government signalled its intention to replace the current supplementary vote system used for electing mayors and police and crime commissioners with first past the post. In the area that many think should be the top priority for reform, however, namely the regulation of online campaigning and spending, the government's proposals are strikingly modest. The Electoral Integrity Bill will introduce so-called digital imprints so that online ads have to show who's promoting them. But early proposals that the Online Harms Framework, now the draft Online Safety Bill, would contain protections against misinformation that harms democracy have been dropped. Well, I'm delighted to say that we have a very distinguished panel to discuss these matters, focusing on the latter issues primarily, but not perhaps entirely. John Pullinger is the chair of the Electoral Commission, a role he took up just last month. He has had a distinguished career in public service and has previously been librarian to the House of Commons and chief executive of the UK Statistics Authority, among other roles. Dr. Kate Dommett is senior lecturer in the public understanding of politics at the University of Sheffield and an expert on how democratic politics is being changed by digital campaigning. She was advisor last year to the House of Lords Committee on Democracy and Digital Technology. And Professor Rachel Gibson is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester. She too is an expert on the political impact of the rise of new information and communication technologies and is currently leading a project on digital campaigning and electoral democracy. We'll begin with input from the speakers for about 5 minutes each, followed by a discussion among the panelists of around about 15 minutes, and then we'll have the remainder of our time for an open Q&A. If you have a question that you would like to put to the panel, then as ever, please write it using the Zoom Q&A function. Our Q&A facilitator, who for this session is Lisa James, will select and read out a broad range of questions on your behalf. If you'd like your question to be anonymous, you can simply tick the anonymity box. And please remember that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the websites, YouTube channels and podcast of the Constitution Unit and Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations. So let me turn over to the first of our speakers, who is John Pullinger.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Robert Hazel called me before I'd even taken up my post, asking if I'd join you today, and I readily said yes, and am pleased to be here now to share some first thoughts. Digital channels are transforming our democracy, and Action now can harness that transformation to make political campaigns better. Without the right action, however, our democracy may not be resilient in the face of the challenges posed by the digital era. But there's nothing unique to elections in this. It applies in the same way to how technology change is affecting so many aspects of our lives, and we can respond in the same way. Voters can already be sceptical about what they see on social media, and practice the art of asking, who is telling me this? Can I be sure it's really from them? Why are they telling me this? Can I believe what they're saying? How can I check it out? And parties, candidates and campaigners can already use digital tools like imprints to show where information is coming from. They know where to go to get someone else to call out slurs and falsehoods, trying to undermine their message. Other voices can already accentuate the positive and shame the bad. Social media platforms, news organisations, influencers and fact checkers increasingly see this as central to their own reputation. A platform is not neutral. It has values and shows its true colours by how it acts. By standing on the sidelines or allowing the flames of falsehoods to be fanned, they are getting the message that they will be seen to be complicit in undermining democracy. By standing tall, they can see that they can provide a vital public service that will enhance their brand. So what's left for campaign regulation? In the scramble for votes, it's human nature to shout loudly about your own merits and your opponent's faults. It can get rough, but there's nothing new here. The digital world simply provides a new battleground for an old battle. So the key task for regulation is to be smart to the modern world and apply the same principles that have always applied to elections in a way that reflects the digital era. I start from the view that we should work with what we've got first and add more regulation as a last resort. There is a lot more to be done to get the existing system working as well as it could. We should focus on this and not take the easy way out that blames an over-complex and outdated rulebook for failure to act on what we already know needs to be addressed. Having said all that, we do need an overhaul if our election system is to stand up to the challenges that lie ahead for our democracy. Now is the time to get ahead of those challenges. Transparency is central to this, and we increasingly struggle to see clearly what's going on. We cannot get the answers we need. Can I see what's behind this information? Who has created it? Why have they targeted me? Who has funded it? Do I have enough knowledge to judge whether I can cast my vote on the basis of what is being said? Can I be confident that one campaign is not being bankrolled to the extent that it can corner the market in what information people get? Can I be confident there's not some outside influence pulling the strings for their own advantage? Unless voters feel they can get answers to these things, there is no basis for democracy. Voters cannot judge completing claims. If voters have no trust in campaign information, there is no campaign. Then the way is clear for demagogues with no interest other than their own desire for power to try and hoodwink us into giving them our vote. Political parties have the strongest interest in getting this right. In considering change, we will need continuous discussion with political parties, campaigners, and candidates. Unless voters can access the information behind the information in real time, it's no use to them. They need it before they cast their vote. In reality, they need it when they first access it, since otherwise the moment will have passed. The online source must itself provide the basis for the voter to click and find to their own satisfaction information that allows them to verify the claims being made and their source. It will not be good enough to say, we've done digital imprints, the problem's solved. In considering change, we will need continuous dialogue with voters, recognising that voters are highly diverse in the way they engage with information. Each of us decides whether someone is trustworthy based on who they are and what they want us to trust them to do. Politicians have never scored too highly in surveys of public trust in the UK. We should worry about this and do what we can to make improvements. However, we should also recognise that our democracy has continued to function and ask why that is. A big part of it has been the role played by intermediary institutions that have influenced us to feel that despite the faults, we're happy to accept that our democracy is still the least worst way of running things. The system of regulation must consider how it can work alongside those who are influential with voters and with campaigners. Nurturing a wide variety of voices for democracy will give election campaigns the greatest resilience. Alongside this, we should be less accepting of those who routinely sneer at politicians and politics for displays of normal human frailty. This is the backdrop to the current constitutional reform agenda at Westminster and in the Parliaments of Wales and Scotland. So how might our legislators and regulators proceed? Legislators know better than most that rules tend to have unintended consequences that were unforeseeable at the time. parliamentary scrutiny provides an opportunity to think through what it is we really want. When legislating for things digital, legislators also know that legislation is slower than innovation and will be asking themselves, how can we future-proof it? Rules tempt the bad guys to work to the letter whilst invading the intention and can trap the innocent into inadvertently tripping the wire. This is a particular concern in our politics, in which volunteers and campaigners in small organisations are so important. Legislation can help set the parameters to minimise this risk, but regulators need to carry out their functions in a way that supports those who do not intend to break the rules, whilst calling out those who willfully do break them. So what should legislators do? The 2018 Electoral Commission report on digital campaigning recommended legislation on digital imprints, better breakdowns of campaign spending, clarity that spending on elections or referendum campaigns by foreign organisations is not allowed, increases in level of sanctions for breaking the rules, and better powers to obtain information outside of an investigation. The report also recommended better joint working with social media companies, better labelling of adverts about elections and referendums, and ensuring social media political advert databases follow UK rules. Finally, it recommended that campaigners provide more detailed and meaningful invoices from their digital suppliers to improve transparency. We have been making progress since then, thanks to the work of legislators in Scotland, Wales, and at UK level. But technology has moved on once more, and maybe we need to get an updated fix on where we are now. This is particularly critical in understanding how to act, given that the digital world does not respect national boundaries. Social media organisations are generally global. The location of a transaction is hard to pin down, and money moves around the world faster than a click. How can we act in the UK unilaterally and multilaterally to mitigate these risks? As the parliaments of the UK try and address these issues over the years ahead, there's an opportunity to look clearly at the issues from the perspective of voters and of campaigners. For voters, the tests for change are whether it makes the electoral process more transparent and gives them more confidence when casting their vote. For parties, candidates and campaigners, the test for change are whether it encourages them to take part in elections and whether it provides effective sanctions against those whose actions give everyone involved in politics a bad name. Above all, now is the time for the parliaments of the UK to send a message that they want UK political campaigning to embrace the digital era, that they support those who want to get involved in politics by enabling the use of digital tools and technologies, and that they will not tolerate the use of online activities that undermine democracy. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. You've given us a huge amount to get our teeth into there, which we will hopefully have time to do later. Let's move on now to Kate.
Thank you. Quite an act to follow. So I think the remarks that I want to make are particularly about the digital space, but then also about the challenges of regulating digital, because I think as John has indicated, this is by no means an easy task. And I do think that there is a reason that securing change in this space has been so difficult. But I think when we look at what's been placed in the public realm around the Electoral Integrity Bill, there are significant signs at the moment that it's just not going to tackle a number of the issues that have been the focus of numerous calls for change. And I think, having been active in this space for quite some time, it is fairly impressive the significant number of different actors who are calling for the same types of change in this space around digital campaigning. And yet, as we get details of this Electoral Integrity Bill, it seems that many of those changes aren't being addressed. And I think that is a fundamental flaw. You know, when we think back to the legislation that governs this area, PROPERA, you know, this was developed in the pre-digital era, and the scale of change is very, very important to recognise. And that doesn't mean that campaigning is revolutionised. You know, offline campaigning and the traditional activities that campaigners are engaged in are as important as ever. But there have been significant changes as a result of digital technology. It's now become cheaper for individuals to campaign. It's much easier to sidestep traditional accountability mechanisms, because campaigners can pop up and disappear and they don't have that reputational legacy that they once did in the past that's been so crucial to our accountability systems. So there are significant changes that have happened as a result of digital technology. And we're also seeing increased amounts of money being channeled into these avenues. So if you look at the figures around advertising, you know, over half of the total spend on advertising is now digital advertising. So we are seeing political parties and campaigners significantly invest in this area. And there's a tendency around digital technology for there to be huge, almost kind of tides of investment in one technology or another. And I think the tide at the moment is that digital technology is seen as key to elections, and we're seeing political parties really invest and build their infrastructure around this area. So it's not a flash in the pan, it's a longer term problem. I think when recognising those changes and those challenges, it's interesting that looking at the proposals that have emerged so far, you know, Alan mentioned in his opening remarks that the online safety white paper is no longer going to be tackling misinformation, disinformation, and the electoral integrity bill seems to be more focused on issues such as voter ID, with very limited movement around the digital realm. And although imprints are to be welcomed, as you know, contacts of the Electoral Commission routinely say, this has been proposed since 2003, and that cannot be the only change in this space. And I think what I want to do with the remainder of the time I have is think about 6 questions that for me are real challenges to regulating digital campaigning and are things that need to be thought about this space. So the first of these is money the best measure? And I think, as I mentioned, that, you know, we have a regulatory system that's based on the regulation of finance, but the norms around what campaigns cost and how that disclosure is happening are changing in the digital realm. So it's much cheaper, as I mentioned, to be able to field campaign material, but also there's other types of resource that are really exacerbated by digital politics, specifically the use of data, and working out how we regulate and oversee the way in which data is counted and monitored within the electoral system is going to be really important going forward. Secondly, I think there's real questions about the electoral campaign period and whether monitoring practice within specific periods is relevant in the digital area, as we're seeing campaigners really engage in this permanent campaign of collecting and harvesting data and information that are then utilised within campaign periods. So, you know, do we need to extend and actually think about constant campaigning and adapt the regulatory system to that? The third question, I think, is this question around working with social media companies. So John mentioned in his opening remarks that you know, these companies have a reputational risk to work with the system. And I think that to date that has been the case. We have seen largely cooperative social media companies working with electoral practice. That isn't guaranteed. And at present, there are a few mechanisms to ensure that cooperation. The major social media companies have emerged out of democratic systems that are relatively similar to ours. And there's potential that the dominant social media companies of the future might not share our values and therefore may not be as amenable to sharing information and working cooperatively to enforce our electoral laws. So I think there really needs to be thought given to how can regulators, and not just the Electoral Commission, really work with social media companies going forward. The fourth question, I think, again, also speaks to what John was saying, and this is around the question of what is it that citizens need to know, and are we actually confident that the mechanisms that we're promoting are going to secure those goals? This is a real concern that I have around digital imprints. I'm a real advocate of transparency, and I think it is a very important component of the system. But there is a danger that if we give people information around the source of a campaign material and that source isn't recognisable, that they could then make mistaken assumptions about the source of that material. They might actually see their trust decrease as a result of getting more information about what's happening and who is funding a piece of online material. And I think we really need to scrutinise how digital media is affecting the way that people consume and respond to information, because I think there's a lot of assumptions within the proposals that are being made at the moment about that we know how citizens will respond and that it will deliver a positive outcome that's going to drive trust and confidence. And I'm really not sure that we're after evidence to back up those presumptions. So I think especially around imprints, that's an area that really needs to be considered going forward as that legislation hopefully continues to evolve after it's implemented. I think the fifth question I have is, around this challenge of perpetual change and what is being regulated. And I think there is a real danger in the debates I've witnessed in this policy space of swinging from the latest innovation or technology. So there was a real concern with political advertising. And I'm thinking we're starting to see a real concern with influence campaigns, and that we're constantly chasing the latest technology. And I think there really does need to be some thinking about, I mean, how do you future-proof this? I'm not going to profess to have the answers, but I think there is a real danger that we're always playing catch up. And therefore, maybe that more principle-based approach of really thinking about, well, what information needs to be there, what needs to be disclosed is going to be really important going forward. And then finally, I think this comes back to the question about the challenge of digital. So digital isn't just something that affects campaigning, it's affecting society. And yet when we often talk about things like the challenge of digital campaigning, we think about very specific reforms to the Electoral Commission's powers or to other regulators' powers. But actually we need to think on a much more systemic level. There are not only, if you just think at the level of regulators, there are so many regulators whose work touches this space. The ICO, the Electoral Commission, the Advertising Standards Agency, Ofcom. How are these regulators working together, and how is the government thinking about how those relationships can best operate? I think there's real need to think about this, not least in terms of upskilling regulators in the civil service with the skills they need to be able to regulate and to do that big data analysis and to catch up with the skills that social media companies have. So I think that it's great that we're finally seeing some legislation emerge in this area, but I think these 6 questions are things that I haven't yet seen answers to, but I think there are going to be real challenges to address going forward.
Wonderful, Kate. Thank you very much. And subscribers to the Constitution Unit blog may have noticed that we carried a blog post by Kate this morning that develops these 6 questions in further detail. So if anyone wants more, then do go onto the Constitution Unit blog and you can find it there. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So going last, as Kate said, following that, it's like now following Kate and John, I'll try to do and try to bring a slightly different perspective, I think. So the contribution, or my contribution, I think, is informed by the work I'm currently doing with the all-party parliamentary group on political literacy, and a recent University of Manchester project with my colleague Ariadna Tessina, which is focusing on changes to education policy as a means of combating sort of the democratic problems that are created by misinformation and micro-targeting. And specifically, we're looking at the sort of opportunities for designing and embedding more sort of online informational resources for teachers to bring digital information literacy skills into the classroom and provide a more coherent and structured way of dealing with some of these problems than perhaps the current piecemeal approach. So given this, I think I come at this policy question from a slightly different angle, which is really to focus on perhaps the bottom-up methods to tackle the problems around digital advertising, rather than perhaps the top-down solutions. So of course, I would support more transparency in political advertising, and I can certainly see that action by the government and the social media companies in this area is necessary. I think I'd argue that perhaps we're missing a trick or an important point if we focus only on the regulation of advertising. I think it's essential as an endpoint, but this endpoint is a much longer chain of influence. And so I think the monitoring and the oversight is important. I think there's a whole lot more actually that can and should be done earlier than this point, before we encounter political ads within schools environment, that probably would help to build up citizen awareness and our ability to understand the new sort of information ecosystem that we exist in. I think this would inevitably build a greater awareness and more critical approach to political advertising among citizens that would perhaps, or hopefully possibly, reduce the need for this kind of ex post sort of intervention. I should qualify my comments by acknowledging that I think this type of sort of belt and braces approach I recognise is idealistic, aspirational perhaps, and also costly. That said, I think if we are looking for examples of how this could be done, I don't think we need to look that far afield. I'd point to the example, particularly of Finland, which has been actually ranked recently as Europe's leading country in terms of its preparedness to deal with and withstand the impact of misinformation. The Finnish government sort of set a very promising example for building a kind of mass scale resilience to problematic political content in the digital age through its integration of digital information literacy into its national curriculum. So now all schools all levels of schooling have been redesigned to incorporate teaching of what they call 21st century skills. It was a long process, 3 years. But the idea is to build and introduce multi-literacy digital competence and media education as core curricula components that are covered by all subjects, not just sort of hived off into one area. Evaluation, obviously, of their efforts is early days, but there is evidence growing in our report that we've produced into this, which is actually forthcoming soon, hopefully at Manchester. We found there was evidence in American Educational Research Journal, the Lancet, that media literacy education as a means of combating misinformation in schools, particularly health claims, it does work to help improve students' ability to assess the accuracy of information received. I think closer to home here in the UK, I'd also make the point that the recently widely cited reports on how to combat the spread of misinformation and sort of online harms by the DCMS, but also the House of Lords report, which Kate was involved with, and both explicitly focused on the importance of digital information literacy, with the former in particular viewing it as what they call the fourth pillar of education alongside the sort of core components of reading, writing and mathematics. And I think there's certainly a need for it. There's a study by the National Literacy Trust in 2018, Fake News and Critical Literacy, which pointed out that 2% of children and of young people in the UK actually have what they call critical literacy skills, to be able to tell if a news story is real or fake. And 53% of teachers believe that the national curriculum does not equip pupils with the skills necessary to identify fake news. So I think, and I would argue that despite the promise perhaps that digital information literacy education holds for helping to combat some of these problems, I think the current provision within schools is limited. And this again was the focus of our recent report. And from what I can see so far, and maybe others in the audience might be able to kind of help me find, there's not been a huge amount of evidence that in the government proposals that indicates there will be a focus on education policy and promoting digital information literacy within the population. So I just like to use my time on the panel maybe to argue for more of a focus on the development of this important skill, and maybe provoke a little bit of debate around the merits of how we might go about designing some sort of overarching strategic framework for the provision of this. I just end with perhaps a couple of comments. The first, if starting that debate, I think there's a question of what. So there's obviously the question of what do we mean by digital information literacy? And as academic, we love definitions. I have my own. I can sort of come back to that in the Q&A about what I think it comprises of. But that's obviously something where I think there's actually one of the barriers is because we don't have a commonly agreed understanding of what that term means. And there are various other terms, media literacy, critical literacy, information literacy. So there's a lack of kind of agreement and perhaps confusion, which inhibits perhaps the rollout of a more comprehensive policy. I think the other one is the where question around digital information. Where do you put it in the curriculum? How do you deal with it? Currently, it tends to now be sort of shoehorned into sort of life skills or discussed perhaps as part of a politics module or a media module, but it's very discrete. And I think there's a case for much greater sort of cross-disciplinary embedding of it. And this is certainly the Finnish approach, that it needs to be incorporated across the board. I think the final thing I'd mention is just actually a sort of anecdote from an event that I was present at yesterday. So I was involved in a Guardian panel where we were talking about the kind of rise of fake news and some of the problems of trying to counter this. And one of these speakers was from Full Fact, and he made the point, which I thought was very telling, was that he said, even if we get to a point where ads or content or posts are fully accurate, they have a clear imprint, so we know everything about them, they could still be, if you like, sort of problematic in terms of the information that is being conveyed if it's not contextualized, that it's not presented in a way that people understand the figures and the facts and be able to sort of assess that critically. And his point was it's the narrative around the facts that is the important element that people need to understand. And I think that's where I would come back to about ads and the regulation, giving people the skills to sort of critically assess the narrative that lies behind and the context in which the information is presented, arguably is the most important thing I think we can do to sort of try to give people the ability to sort of navigate the new sort of digital campaign ad environment. But that's not to say that top-down approaches are not important as well. So I'll end there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rachel, reminding us that these issues are much broader than just the electoral arena. And let me pick that up with John in a moment. But before I do so, let me remind everyone to put in your questions in the Q&A if you'd like to put a question to the panel. We've got up to 10:30 in this session, so hopefully we have time to get through a number of questions. And John, can I maybe, just before we go to those questions, pick up with you? So both Kate and Rachel have highlighted the fact that the issues that we're dealing with here are really large. Kate talked about the fact that we're talking about a digital revolution across society. Rachel emphasized that the solutions to the issues that we see, as I said, extend far beyond just the electoral arena. I guess the Electoral Commission might occasionally be accused of focusing on digital imprints and information on invoices and fairly small kind of technical changes. Is it possible for the Electoral Commission to engage in a broader discussion, to engage with other actors in order to push forward a wider agenda, if indeed the Electoral Commission thinks that a wider agenda is needed?
Well, I mean, the Electoral Commission's got quite a precise statutory remit, and I mean, you've indicated it kind of dates from the pre-digital era, but I mean, we have a job to do that's been given us by Parliament, and we do it. But I think a key part of what I want to do as chair is to make sure the Commission really is engaging much more actively with the political world, to make sure it interprets its remit in a way that is going to make the most positive difference to our democracy. So in my presentation, I stressed the importance of really getting onto the wavelength of campaigners and candidates and parties to just understand what good practice is and how we can support that. And similarly with voters, I think the points that Rachel makes are very, very well and clearly made. And I think for the Commission to understand how people receive information when they think about casting their vote, and therefore where the harms lie and where they don't lie, I think the Commission does need to look at that. And the report we did in 2018, looking at the kinds of things which you might want to bring forward in terms of legislation or better regulatory practice, I think possibly now is the time to have another look at doing something like that. But I do, above all, think there's a lot more we can get out of the current system. And Kate's point about getting the regulators to work together, and I do really want to build very good relationships with my counterparts in the other regulators that Kate mentioned, the ICO, Ofcom, advertising standards, and kind of many more. I mean, the whole world of influence is one I think that is critical and not very well touched by us, but this is where people are really getting their information. This is where they are trying to interpret and get the context that Rachel describes. So I think we need to engage with those people so that we can interpret our remit in a way that really does help bolster us against the threats which we see coming very fast towards us.
Thank you. Kate, you talked about all of these questions that are not being answered and issues that are not being tackled. Why do you think that is? Why is it that it's taken 18 years to get a really minimal change in digital imprints, and that so many other things are not being addressed at the moment?
This is always a challenging question. It's one I like to ask regulators when I'm speaking to them myself. And I think fundamentally it comes down to political will. It is pretty overwhelming, the amount of similar calls that have been made for change in this space. You know, if you kind of look at theories of policy making, I teach my undergraduates, you know, there is a high degree of consensus about what needs to change in certain areas, but just no real imperative to drive that forward. And, you know, it goes back to the truism of the people who are regulating are the people who are benefiting from these technologies, or at least perceive that they're benefiting from these technologies and techniques. And when we see, you know, the Conservative Party engaging in campaign tactics like creating a false Labour website, or changing their Twitter name as at the last election, and other parties doing similar misleading behaviours at different levels. They clearly think that they're gaining a benefit from these kind of activities in terms of their ability to secure electoral victory. In which context, where is the incentive to put in place a code of conduct for behaviour for political parties around digital campaigning, or to grant more powers for the Electoral Commission to sanction or investigate? I think there's a real roadblock here around the relationships between the regulators and the politicians, and I think we're kind of seeing that play out in the proposals that were made yesterday around the Electoral Commission's accountability.
Rachel, do you have a view on that same question? Is it just that this is too much kind of process and the public just don't really care, so the politicians don't feel under pressure, and they benefit from the current rules, so why would they change them?
I mean, I go back to John's point, I think, about the idea that in terms of being able to understand perhaps the context, I do think there should be more emphasis on I don't want to say the top-down approach, because I do think it's relevant. I'm not sort of trying to imply that sort of regulation doesn't matter. It really does. But I suppose what I do think is that this area of kind of the bottom-up side of it is easier to neglect, perhaps, just because it's a long-term, slow burn. It's something that you don't see results immediately. So the investment in it, you don't get that kind of sort of quick sort of fix, or be able to sort of be, to sort of show that it's working, not working. So I suppose in that sense, I'd say there's, I wouldn't say reluctance, but perhaps, the sort of electoral cycle, the sort of short-term sort of nature of elections means that, it's probably difficult for investment in this sort of area, but it should be there. And people like John, sort of being aware of that, understanding that, the ICO, knowing, is really important, I think, for that kind of sort of recognition. So hopefully that can sort of generate and trickle up to the government as well. But, it needs kind of sort of investment, I suppose, is sort of the way I put it. Yeah.
Very true. Good. Let's go over now to Lisa James, who's got a range of questions from the audience, and is hopefully just about to appear on our screens. There's Lisa. Excellent. Yes. Lisa, what do you have for us?
I have some really interesting questions from the audience. So we're going to start with one from Petra Schleiter, who's professor at Oxford and one of the co-organisers of this conference. And she writes, my question focuses on those initiatives that appear to restrict ballot access. For instance, I understand that according to the estimates of the Electoral Commission, the introduction of voter ID would currently adversely affect between 7.5% and 24% of the electorate, depending on which form is required. We can be sure that not all of those voters will acquire those forms of ID, and that a sizable group will end up disenfranchised. In an international context in which voter suppression is increasingly common, how troubling a development is this? Our second question, a slightly different topic, is posed by a couple of people, by Kelly Shuttleworth of the Institute for Government, and by Alistair Endersby, a school politics teacher. And they both write in to ask Rachel particularly, do you have proposals for increasing digital information literacy in older generations, or would you mostly focus on school education? And Alistair, with his perspective as a politics teacher, writes that he's found that young people are usually pretty digitally savvy. How much more worried should we be about older people believing what they read on Facebook? And finally, a question from Tom Brake, who's the director of Unlock Democracy and a former member of Parliament. A question principally, but I think not only for John. The Electoral Commission were considering using powers under Papira to prosecute serious breaches. The government yesterday stated that they would close down that option. What would be the impact on the Electoral Commission of this announcement? And could it mean that serious breaches will now go unchallenged?
Great questions. Thank you so much, Lisa. Rachel, shall we start off with you on the middle of those questions from Kelly and Alistair on older generations and education?
Well, yes, this is the one thing that we didn't cover in our study. So, but it's something that we did think about, because obviously what we're talking about here is not simply a sort of schools, young people needing these skills. We're talking about critical thinking more broadly, and the idea of the whole, if you like, information system, I think, has really changed for everybody. So trying to kind of, the ways in which you acquired knowledge 20 years ago, it is very different, and that affects not just young people, but older people as well. And I can see the argument that obviously then there's perhaps a sort of a generation of older people who are perhaps more in need of some of this training or education than younger people. But in terms of how that would be delivered, I mean, I suppose maybe this is a cop-out, but maybe the trickle-up approach, so that we've got to start somewhere. And I suppose if the idea is that we try to sort of get students at a younger age that become more involved. I mean, there is sort of the opportunity perhaps when they would go home, they would talk more about their learning, what they're understanding about the world, and use that as a sort of reverse sort of element that they could talk to their parents or talk to their grandparents, and use the kind of skills that they're acquiring to help them. So I don't have an immediate answer as to how that could be done. I mean, obviously, I think there are ways that you could, provide resources, you could provide training, you think about different mechanisms that could be delivered. But I would argue that perhaps there would potentially be, a longer term sort of trickle up, and these younger people will eventually obviously get older, and there will be a sort of generational replacement. So I have to confess, I haven't got a quick answer, but I'll have to think about it and maybe see if I can get something by the end of the session as well. Sure,
there are all sorts of issues in this area. Kate, can I ask you about the voter ID question? I know, again, this is not an issue I think that you have directly done research on, but Petra raises a really important question there about the impact of that and how it sits in the international scene at the moment as well.
Yeah, I think this is a seriously important question, and it's not my area of expertise, but thankfully we have some excellent academics who have been doing in this work. And the Electoral Integrity Project that's being run by Toby James, they've produced a really excellent briefing around the impact of having to show ID at the polling station, what that would be. And they revealed that there is very little evidence of the problem that is proposally being tackled here around personation at polling station, but there is this real risk that it reduces participation. And for me, this goes back to what John was saying at the beginning, and this is, there are certain principles around our elections that we need to uphold, and one of them is about encouraging participation and doing everything that we can to foster that. And in that context, I think these proposed changes are very concerning, because, the evidence that we have so far is that they're likely to decrease participation. So I think there is a real concern about why these changes are being pushed forward, where there doesn't really seem to be need for this, because the problem isn't being well evidenced, but there do seem to be some very detrimental outcomes as a result of this policy being implemented.
John, does the Electoral Commission have a view on voter ID, and also Tom Brake's question as to the likely impact of yesterday's announcement on banning the Electoral Commission from bringing criminal prosecutions?
Well, I'll start with voter ID. I mean, the Electoral Commission thinks there are three conditions that have to be satisfied when you're thinking about these things. The first is that the ballot should be secure, that when a vote is meant to be your vote, it's you that cast it and not someone else. It also thinks that voting should be straightforward and easy for people, and you should take away barriers to voting rather than erect more. And it also thinks the whole system needs to be practical for the people at the polling stations to actually administer this. There mustn't be some great complexity. Now, the numbers that Petra quoted are the numbers of people who don't currently have a photo ID, and therefore if they were suddenly required today to go and give photo ID, then they would be disenfranchised. But the Electoral Commission's view is that we ought to be able to find a solution that meets all three of those requirements, that does give us security against a risk. And Kate's right, the evidence of personation is that it's very limited. But it is an open risk, and international observers at our elections have cited this as a particular risk in the current UK system. And cases like the one in Tower Hamlets a few years ago was one where this really was a worry, and it could become a worry. So if we can mitigate it, we should. But at the same time, if you're going to go to a system of photo ID, you need to make it absolutely seamless for people to get hold of a photo ID. And the government's proposals are looking at that, and we're discussing that with them to see how we can make this not something that does disenfranchise people, because that would be something which we should care, we do care about, we should care about, and Petra is right to raise it. But then finally, we shouldn't come up with a solution that then is impossible or really difficult for people at polling stations to actually manage to administer and not put them in a very invidious position. So that's where the Electoral Commission stands on that one. On Tom's question about prosecution's power, the preparer legislation included a prosecution's power for the Electoral Commission, very similar to the kinds of powers that many other regulators have got. Now, the Electoral Commission has never used that power, but a while ago started to ask the question: if we were in a situation where we wanted to invoke that, what kind of capacity should we have? And there was a discussion at the Electoral Commission board about it before my time. And the minutes of those meetings are in the public domain, and that was picked up, and people said, the Electoral Commission is wanting to extend its powers. Now, it was simply wanting to use the powers that the Parliament had already given it, but it hadn't used them before. And what the government is now saying was, we think actually the right authority for exercising prosecution powers are the police and the CPS. So I think the question to be asked here is, who is the best organisation, who is the organisation best placed to carry forward prosecutions? Now, it is what the police and the CPS do as their day job, so they should be, in principle, best placed with the skills, but they've got a lot of other things on their plate. The Electoral Commission hasn't got it at the moment, but could potentially learn from other regulators who operate in this situation. But the most important thing to me is that where there are offences prescribed by Parliament, someone needs to prosecute them and take them forward, otherwise there's no deterrent. So if the proposals that were announced yesterday go forward, I think the key question is, so can we be confident that someone else would pick up the reins and take forward prosecutions were they to be necessary?
Thank you, John. Lisa, back to you for another round of questions.
Thank you. And another round of quite meaty questions. So this may in fact be the round that we finish on. But I'll start with a question from Glenn Tarman of Full Fact, who writes in to ask, Ofcom will have new powers on media literacy due to the Online Safety Bill, and DCMS will this year publish the UK's media literacy strategy. This could offer levers to transform the skills of the UK population, but ambition could be too low for this to happen. So what can be done to make sure that that skills transformation does take place with regard to citizenship and digital literacy on elections and wider participation in democratic processes? Second, another question from Tom Brake, who writes in with a follow-up, and asks, could the regulators and other partners do more to work together on the issue of tech developments and developing some basic standards, similar to the challenges that the police face, for example, in keeping on top of tech and its use in crime? So there's an interesting question about what, if anything, might we learn from other sectors and the way in which they've approached technological developments. And finally, a question from an anonymous audience member who asks provocatively, in an era of declining trust, who do you think the public trust more? Regulators or the UK government? So an interesting question there, I suppose, about how regulators can build public trust in the standards that they set.
Fantastic, Lisa, thank you very much. Kate, I wonder if you might want to pick up that final question, actually, that anonymous question on trust, because it's a really fundamental issue.
Yeah, all three of these questions are great, but that last one is really interesting. I noticed it come in. So I don't have exact comparative data. We did like some pilot survey data that was looking at the levels of public trust in the people's trust in the civil services use of data and politicians' use of data and like NHS's use of data. And it kind of came back that the civil service is more trusted than politicians, perhaps unsurprisingly, because politicians are routinely rank at the lowest of the low on all of these kind of surveys. But I would presume that would carry over to regulators. and that you would therefore see regulators receiving higher levels of trust than you would politicians, because they do have that sense of neutrality. I think what would be interesting is to look at perceptions of different degrees of regulators and whether certain regulators have managed to cultivate a more positive public image than others. But I think, I'm not aware of data that's looking at specifically on regulators and government, but I do think it is an issue. I think, speaking perhaps to the last question, I think where the danger lies is where regulators come to be seen as politicized and where that boundary is blurred. And so, that principle of independence and the ability to hold politicians to account and be seen as, neutral and non-partisan is absolutely critical in this space to ensuring that regulators do maintain high levels of public trust.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to pick up the question on literacy and how we can actually make the changes that are in the pipeline really bite?
Well, yes, I did ask if anybody had any, and so if Ofcom is sort of moving to implement this is good news. And what I would say is though that I do think that the emphasis perhaps on safety and harms around the sort of the agenda about digital information literacy is, I wouldn't say incorrect, but I sort of slightly worry that they're sort of conflated, and because I think that digital information literacy, yes, it is about equipping people to protect themselves against sort of, online harms, but it's much more than that, I think. And what I'm sort of conscious of is a sort of embedding and kind of deeper sort of socialization with digital information literacy skill, which is more linked to kind of sort of academic learning, if you like. And, there are components from politics, from history, from media studies, from computer science, that these things are all, it's more about, I don't say life skill, perhaps is putting it too strong, but I think that it is something that is not just simply, I don't think necessarily equates with tackling a harm or necessarily always about keeping people safe, quote. It's actually sort of more generally about sort of citizenship more broadly and how you engage with information, with knowledge. So I don't know the specifics of what Ofcom might be proposing, but I hope that, I suppose, I'd like to think that it's ambitious, and that it's not simply about sort of just trying to find a way. I know that vaccines are common, but the inoculation thing, we've got a problem, let's inoculate, and then we'll move on to the next problem. It's a sort of deeper seated sort of proposal that is actually designed to sort of really kind of sort of try and build a resilience, perhaps an underlying resilience, and develop a sort of stronger sense of citizenship in a positive direction, as well as sort of trying to protect us against harms and negative influence. Anyway, sort of a very broad.
No, very good, thank you. And John, finally, so Tom asked about whether you could say a bit more about the regulators working together, but also we have this, I think, really fundamental question about trust. And I guess, would you acknowledge that the Electoral Commission does have a bit of an issue with trust? There has been a perception that has developed among some, particularly on the Brexit side, particularly among Conservatives, that the Electoral Commission has not been entirely fair to them over recent years. It may be an unfair perception, but would you acknowledge that such a perception does exist? And how would you try to build trust now?
Well, first of all, I do acknowledge it. The advantage I've had coming into this post is seeing all the evidence submitted to various parliamentary inquiries, and the vast majority of it is extremely complimentary and supportive of the Electoral Commission. But the testimony isn't, and it's not only the Conservative Party or people who were supportive of the Brexit campaign and the referendum. There are a number of things there that suggest there is a concern we need to address. And I think something I need to do as chair is reach out, particularly to the Conservative Party in this instance, but to all the parties, to make sure there is a level of trust. And because without it, what's the point? And the key element here is that if we want the public to trust us, we must be seen to be impartial. And if people do not see us as impartial, and it is a feeling rather than a fact, that's how it is, then that's our problem that we need to address. So that's a key task, I think, that I have over the next few years, to make sure that what the Electoral Commission does command broad acceptance and confidence across the political spectrum, so we can speak with authority and voters can accept what we say. I mean, on the two questions, on the one about who do the public trust, I mean, I think it's unlikely they will ever trust any of us as much as they trust their own community. And we haven't talked about diversity at all. And I mean, Rachel mentioned in passing vaccines, but the vaccines program has been fabulously successful because it has approached people from where they are. It's understood their own concerns and hesitations and sought to address them. And I think that's what we need to do in this space too, particularly the misinformation space, to work with local community groups and organisations on social media and physically in communities, to give them the literacy and the skills they need to navigate their way around what for many groups, particularly the most marginal groups, is a very hostile environment. And especially in voting, to find ways to encourage them to participate and exercise their rights. So I think getting to the diversity of British communities online and offline is a key way of answering the question, the anonymous question. But finally, to Tom's question, the simple answer is yes. And it feels like a priority for me to work with the other regulators in this space and people who are kind of really part of that ecosystem too. Full fact's been mentioned a couple of times. I mean, they've got a great insight into the way we think about information, to get all of us working together and thoughtfully about what is the digital world doing to this world, I think is very important to us, and certainly something I see as important to me.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to you all. We have a really broad agenda for this session. We could have gone on for much longer. There are many questions that we haven't been able to address, but you've all been full of insight. So thank you so much to Rachel Gibson, to Kate Dommett, and to John Pullinger. Our next session in this conference starts immediately after this one and is on devolution, Scotland and the future of the Union. So we'll have a little hiatus now while the wonderful tech people in the background who make all of this appear easy swap over the speakers from this team to the next team, but do stay on the line, and in just a moment Robert Hazel will appear to chair the next panel. But thank you for now.